I'll try and introduce Pedro, not just as my friend from a very long time ago, but also an honorable professor of the Autonomous University of Querétaro, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Mexico. He's been a visiting scholar at Harvard, at York Universities, and Pablo VI Foundation in Spain. And his work mainly focuses on educational policy, analysis, and particularly the relationship between higher education and human development. He was the network coordinator for the Human Development and Capability Association, but over more than 20 years, he's advised the Ministry of Education in Mexico, and he's also been leading on research projects, particularly for Education Policy Lab. His work crosses the areas of education policy, higher education law, and human development. He's been also the editor of the Mexican Journal of Educational Research and the Inter-American Journal of Adult Education. He's currently working on a project called The Futures of Education, as challenging as it may sound, particularly with universities in Central America. And he's got a forthcoming book in Spanish called Why Education Policies Fail, a governmental analysis from 2018 to 2024. So we are very honored and very, very pleased to have Dr. Flores-Crespo with us today. And without further ado, please, we look forward to hearing your insights on measuring and applying the idea of the common good to higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulava. And I would like to thank the Center for Education Research in Identities and Inequalities for its kind invitation. I hope that we can have an insightful discussion on how the concept of the common good in education can help us design more effective policies in a runaway world. So I have divided the presentation into three main parts. In the first part of my presentation, I will explain why the concept of the common good may advance the idea of public good. According to Charles Hess and Elinor Ostrom, the more people use, acknowledge, the more the common good grows. And the key question, however, is how such knowledge is created, not only regulated within our educational system and ultimately within our universities. In the second part of this talk, or this part of the second part of the talk, focuses on the empirical aspect. In 2020, a research team launched a study to try to measure the common good in 9 Mexican universities, 4 public, 5 private. And in Mexico, as you may know, the main distinction between public and private university is that the former charge a relatively low tuition, whereas private institutions imposed a very high direct cost. But it's important to know that the fee variation doesn't necessarily correlate with educational quality. In fact, most public higher education in Mexico lead in scientific research and cultural activities, unlike private ones. In the final part of the presentation, I will discuss how our research findings could inform public policy making. And I will argue that using the idea of the common good encourage institutions to focus not only on outcomes, but also on internal educational processes. A conceptual renovation, according to me, may enhance existing metrics for assessing the quality of higher education. In other words, academic processes matter, not just the results. So let's move on to the first part of the presentation, education as a public good, as a common good. And as many of you know, the idea of the common good in education has become topical. International organizations such as UNESCO have proposed framing education as a common good to distinguish knowledge from a mere commodity. If higher education is seen as a commodity, only those with purchasing power can access to it, and the market, in this case, regulates supply and demand. From this perspective, public funding is restricted as education becomes a private good and tuition fees policies are justified. But as a consequence of this uh, policy, many young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are excluded. In Mexico, only 44% of the total population age 18 to 22 years old is attending university. 4 out of 10 people age 18 to 22 is attending a higher education institution. On the other hand, to prevent people from exclusion, education in general and higher education in particular can be viewed as a public good. Following Samuelson's concept of public good, Simon Marginson notes that, I'm quoting, goods are public when market-based production cannot generate profit or a profit because the goods concerned are not exclusive and nor rival roles. What does it mean? That public goods must benefit all, and their use by one person doesn't reduce their ability to others. So as we can see, how to define a good, could be private, public, or common, has a deep implications for public policies. If university degrees are considered private goods, individuals must pay for them because they provide personal benefits in the future. On the other hand, if higher education is viewed as a public good, the benefits extend beyond the individual dimension, requiring public funding to reach diverse social groups. And in this case, states rather than markets regulate the educational provision. When we speak of education as a common good, we span the conversation. Not only the state and market, but also communities regulates acknowledged production. Elinor Ostrom emphasized that common goods are created and governed by communities. Even though UNESCO has proposed replacing public good with the common good term, the two notions overlap, as Simon Marginson rightly observes. Public education as a common good must still be publicly funded to expand access and ensure that education remains a universal right. If we have said this, or haven't said this, what is the innovation? When using and applying the term common good to education, two issues, at least two issues, deserve further discussion. First, the question of acknowledged production. Since the notion of common good is relational, according to Matsukato, we must ask not only how states or market regulate education, but also how knowledge is created, managed, and governed within a specific community. Our research, our empirical research, sought to explore exactly this, how university communities organize themselves to produce knowledge within a particular setting, and we use 9 Mexican universities as case studies. We call this approach as an internal notion of common good, which differs in some sense from that assess why higher education uh, institutions produce or create globally. The distinction matters since some authors have suggested that higher education could be one key to evolving the global common goods approach. As Simon Marginson notes, international cooperation between scientists can foster the creation of global knowledge across distances. Second point, we must consider the role of individuals within this approach, an issue normally missed when education is seen as a common good. And some authors may assume that the term common and individual are opposing concepts and see, for instance, the critique of Michael Sandel on meritocracy in the US. But education benefits both individuals and society before, during, and after the educational process. And knowledge generates impacts beyond the personal sphere, therefore, subsidizing higher education is fair. Universities do much more than prepare students for the labor market and to obtain an income. And to obtaining an income is a very important thing, but it's a small, very important of the knowledge acquisition. But the education also cultivates citizenship, critical thinking, and other non-material outcomes such as the freedom to reason freely, as Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen and their followers have argued. In short, one thing is the impact of education on individuals nationally or globally, and another quite different is how individuals are situated in the common good approach. The impact of education is one question, an empirical one. How do we measure individual and collective outcomes? But there is also an ontological perspective. That is, how are individuals doing in the common good approach? In promoting this, the common good approach, I will say that individuality doesn't vanish, it's rather the opposite. As Ostrom show and our research confirms, common goods are mediated by individual rationalities and a diversity of individual rationalities. And now let's move on to the second part of the presentation on what was research. The main purpose of our empirical research project was to construct a proxy for the common good using, as I said, 9 Mexican universities as case studies. Our criteria for selections were mainly regional, institutional, and practical. 8 universities were located in Querétaro, my home state. 3 were technological-oriented organizations, and 5 of the 9 were private religious-based institutions. We wanted to understand how a university community might create common good through daily and institutional relationships among students, teachers, and administrative staff. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, common good refers to those facilities that the members of a community provide to all members in order to fulfill a relational obligation they all have to care for interests they have in common. So as we can see in this definition, or this definition implies cooperation, common goals that are pursued rationally, a social glue called obligation, and relationships between individuals. Matsukato likewise confirms that the concept of the common good is relational. So following this line of reasoning, we identify 2 core relationships in our research project. The first is the teaching relationship related to how education is delivered in a university. And the second is the research relationship concerned with how scientific knowledge is produced. Once these relationships were identified, they were operationalized into 5 key dimensions: human agency, institution stability, governance, fairness, and human flourishing. Each dimension was observed empirically by surveying a probabilistic sample of students, teachers, and administrative staff. The questionnaire was applied online, and it included 76 questions using the Likert scale, and an item reliability test was used. We gathered over 5,000 valid responses, a considerable amount of information, and the analysis, the data analysis was very, very complicated, and my colleagues who are deal with technical stuff did a superb job in this aspect on this regard, but we still struggling with how to present the information that we gather, and for this reason, your feedback will be very, very useful. So what did we find? This is the reliability test for those who are interested in technical stuff. So what did we find? First of all, we found that a structural model showed that human agency was positively related to 3 dimensions of the common good: fairness, institutional stability, and governance, and ultimately to human flourishing. And this means that without the freedom to pursue what one values and has reason to value, the common good cannot emerge. In other words, individuality and the common good are not opposites, rather they are closed. But while structural models could show a close and positive relationship between variables with some reliability, they say little about how individuals are doing within a community, within a structure. So as we can see in this chart, human agency varies among university and by gender. And let me explain briefly this chart. The x-axis that you can see here show the universities that were selected for this research. And in this chart, as you can see, there are 8 out of 9 universities because my home university was excluded from this chart because we couldn't reach enough respondents, and therefore its sample was not representative of the total population. The y-axis, this one, represents the proportion of replies in terms of agency. The boxes, the pink ones and the blue ones, represent the interquartile ranges. That is, the numbers that are above the lowest 20% and below the top 20%. In short, the pink and blue boxes concentrate 50% of the gathered responses. And within the boxes, as you can see, there is a red dot that stands for the mean. And there's also a black horizontal line that represents the median. The former, as you know, is an average number, while the latter is the middle point of a data set. Using the interquartile ranges made the data more comparable among universities and the measurement of the common more accessible. The key point here is that agency varies between institutions and by gender. For example, one private religious-oriented university, Geneva, which is in the middle of this chart, score lowest on agency, especially on women. And gender clearly matters when we speak of common good. When comparing overall common good, this private university again performed poorly, and this university is represented in this chart by the yellow box. So I would like to comment on additional point on this chart. As was anticipated, the aggregated measure of common good varied across university, as you can see by the dots or the black horizontal line, which is the median. This means that what each higher education produces internally may result from its own institutional processes. And if this is true, could it be that each university has a variable degree of quality that correlates with its level of common good, regardless of outcome? Again, could it be that each university has a variable degree of quality that correlates with its level of common good, regardless of outcome? In order to support this point, have a look at this chart. The most prestigious and productive university, my home university, that is represented here in the purple box, didn't score highest in common good. The Autonomous University of Querétaro scored a relatively low mean in terms of common good in comparison with those of the other higher education institutions. So my university, despite strong academic output, show a relatively weak teaching and research relationships. In other words, common good doesn't relate positively and directly to outcomes. And this confirms what Charles Hess and Elinor Ostrom have said. A commons is not value-laden. Its outcome can be good or bad, sustainable or not. And this is why, according to these authors, we do need understanding and clarity, skilled decision-making abilities, and cooperative management strategies in order to ensure durable and robust system. And this is a normative point of view. And this normative point of view suggests that mainstream methods for measuring the quality of education tend to focus more on outcomes than on process, even though both may be related. By paying close attention to how university agents interact, teaching and research relationship can be modified. And through this, according to me, and it's an argument that is put in on the table of discussion, the common good can be expanded. Again, by paying close attention to how university agents interact, teaching and research relationships can be modified, and through this, the common good can be expanded. This approach may serve as an alternative and complementary metric for evaluating the performance of higher education institutions. That's our argument, because there's a research team. So I will argue that the quality of institutional processes matter, not just outputs or mainstream performance indicators. And as a way to explore the institutional settings where these processes take shape, we evaluated the perception of the common good by different university agents, and in some cases, the variations were striking, as we can see in the next chart. Let me highlight 3 points from this slide. First, in 4 out of 5 private universities, the value of the common good as reported by students is lower than that reported by academic and administrative staff. And this result is especially surprising in a university called UPAEP, which is here in the middle of the chart, because this university has an explicit mission, the common good approach. So it's very, very interesting. Second, in 5 of the 9 institutions, the value of the common good expressed by academic staff is lower than that by administrative staff. And as a researcher, as a university researcher, this raises an important question. Who governs our university in our countries? Scientific communities, academic groups, administrative staff, or political bureaucracies? So, third point, in 3 public technological universities, which are here in the right of the chart, this one, These three universities are technological universities. Students report higher levels of common good than teachers and administrative staff, and this finding is relevant as these students often come from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. So all these variations may be explained by differences between different institutional settings where the members of the community interact on a daily basis. And these interactions are the basis for the creation of knowledge. Universities play a key role in this process by organizing their communities to re-examine existing information, cultivate independent thinking in young people, and foster free expression in the pursuit of truth. Higher education institutions could contribute significantly to the global common good, but only, that's another our arguments, but only if they first understand how they function internally, especially in today's complex and rapidly changing world. To conclude, the study of the common good in higher education is worthwhile because, as Hess and Ostrom argue, knowledge is non-subtractive. That is, the more people use it, the more the common good grows. The concept of the common good in education enhances that of the public good in at least two ways. Firstly, it shifts focus toward how knowledge is created, not just how it's regulated and distributed. And this is not necessarily an epistemological question, but rather is an institutional aspect. Secondly, since the concept of the common good is relational, it demands a better understanding of how members of a university community interact, organize themselves to produce specialized knowledge collectively. This means that the institutional process matter, not only mainstream performance indicators. Improving institutional quality may therefore depend on how members of a university community act, relate, and organize themselves on a daily basis, not just on how much they produce by the end of the academic year. This conceptual shift that I'm presenting here is relevant because a renovated approach to the policymaking process can emerge from it. Individuals and common good are not opposites, rather they are deeply interconnected, and our empirical analysis confirms this. Academic freedom is a key component of common good creation. And I will say, following this line of reasoning, that elected governments should not interfere with what a university has reasonably established as its normative framework, and they must ensure public funding and institutional freedom to achieve both quality of education and to expand the common good. So I will conclude saying that individuals flourish in groups, collectivities, within specific institutional settings, and with a little help from my friends as the youth, as the Beatles used to sing, creating with their lovely music a common good that is now valuable globally. Thank you very much for